Okay, bienvenidos a todos. Welcome everybody to our very special program this evening, Stories from the Sephardic Cuban Experience. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, La Hermandad Sephardi de America. We're so happy to have you with us here tonight for a very special program with our dear friend, Professor Ruth Behar. Just a reminder, this program is through what we're calling the Sephardic Digital Academy, a brand new initiative launched a few months ago to help bring you all different kinds of content from Sephardic customs and traditions to Ladino culture, Ladino language classes, Sephardic Torah, history, and so much more, including Sephardic cooking, delicious Sephardic cooking with many people as well. You can find out all the information about all these different amazing classes at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. Now, it's really a pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Ruth Behar. Ruth, just a moment, sorry, technical issue. Very good. Professor Ruth Behar is the Victor Chaim Pereira Collegiate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. Her honors include a MacArthur Grant, a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, and being named a Great Immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. She was born in Havana and grew up in New York. Her research has taken her to Spain and Mexico and on return journeys to Cuba. She is an author of acclaimed and prize-winning books, including Lucky Broken Girl, a novel about her immigrant childhood, and the Travel Chronicles, an island called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba, and Traveling Heavy, a memoir in between journeys. Her poems are collected in a bilingual edition, Everything I Kept, Todo Lo Que Guarde, and her documentary, Adia Querida, A Cuban Sephardic Journey, is distributed through Women Make Movies. Her new young adult novel, Letters from Cuba, inspired by her maternal grandmother's escape from Poland to Cuba, was released on August 25th, 2020. Such a pleasure to have you here tonight, Professor Behar. Please, whenever you are ready.
Thank you so much, Ethan. I'm so happy to be here. How is my volume? Is this good?
Excellent.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you to you and to the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to talk about stories from the Sephardic Cuban experience. Thanks to everybody who's tuning in today. I think my parents are on, así que mami, papi, gracias. Thanks for being here. And hope everybody enjoys this talk, and we'll leave some time later at the end for conversation and questions. So let me get started. All right. So I'm going to talk about a number of things today. Here's just a brief outline. I'm going to talk about Jewish migration to Cuba, especially in the 20s and 30s. I'm going to talk about my own family's journey to Cuba. I'm going to talk about the Jewish community in Cuba on the eve of the revolution in 1959. Then I'm going to talk about the departure of so many of the Cuban Jews to Miami and New York in the 60s. Then I'll talk about my return journeys to Cuba and the research that I have done in Cuba on the Jewish community and specifically on the Sephardic community. I'm going to share some stories from my documentary that Ethan mentioned, Adia Querida, which is about Cuban Sephardic Jews. And then I'm going to have some general comments about Sephardic Cuban identity. And then I'm going to end hopefully with some concluding remarks about being Sephardic in the present, which is a topic that really interests me. So let's get started. All right, so where do I begin this story? There's so many different places from which I could begin historically. And I thought, well, let me begin with a moment that a lot of people have heard about, which is Columbus arriving in the Americas in 1492. He actually lands on the eastern end of Cuba in Baracoa. And it's very interesting that he brings along an interpreter, Luis de Torres, who is pretty clearly thought to have been a converso or a cristiano nuevo cristiano. And he goes as Columbus's interpreter. He spoke Spanish, of course, but he also spoke Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic. And he was brought along just in case any of the natives that they met on this journey might speak any of those languages. So it just shows you that there was a converso presence in Cuba from the very beginning. And historians have found that there were converso families in Cuba in the colonial period during the time of the Spanish Empire. So that's an interesting thing to know. And of course, to remember that during the period of the Spanish Empire, it was impossible to be any other religion but Catholic in the countries of the Spanish Empire, which you all know. Now we're going to skip forward. My apologies to historians. We're going to skip forward from the 15th century to the 19th century and think about the Spanish-American War. So Cuba had three independence wars in the 19th century, and the last war was the successful one because the Spaniards didn't want to let go of Cuba. This was their favorite colony, this pearl of the Antilles, and the United States intervened to get Spain out of Cuba. And that's why we have this cartoon where Uncle Sam is saying, I'll take care of this lady now. In other words, I'll take care of Cuba. And so with that American presence in Cuba at the beginning of the 20th century, it's very interesting with the Americans. We get baseball enters Cuba, and so does religious freedom. So it's after the end of the Spanish Empire, the Jews are able to settle in Cuba. Now, it's important to know that at the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of Jewish immigrants, as you probably know, trying to come and coming to the United States. And in this anti-Semitic cartoon, you can see the way these Jews were portrayed, right, in the popular press in the United States at the time. And so by 1924, the United States passes an Immigration Act that seeks to limit the number of people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this, of course, includes many of the Jews. They're trying to limit that migration, and they impose a quota system. And just to give you an idea, Devin Nard talked about this too in his talk a couple of weeks ago, that they imposed these quotas on the number of immigrants who could come to the United States from particular countries. They wanted mainly immigrants to come from Germany and Britain and Scandinavia and Western Europe. And you can see that the percentage from Poland was at 3%, and from Turkey, even lower, right? So the numbers that could come from those countries into the United States were very, very few. So what did that mean? That so many Jews that were trying to leave Europe between World War I and World War II, a time of growing poverty, a time of growing anti-Semitism, a time of growing upheaval, they couldn't come to the United States. And so many found their way to Cuba. Cuba at the time had an open door policy. They were trying to increase the number of immigrants that came from Europe because Cuba was concerned that their population was growing too Black after the independence of Cuba. So they opened the door to these immigrants, the same immigrants that the United States didn't want, Cuba was accepting. And many, many people immigrated, many Jewish people from Poland and Russia on the Ashkenazi side, and from Turkey and also Syria on the Sephardic side, and went to Cuba in the teens, 20s, and 30s in particular. And when they got to Cuba, there was already an American Jewish community there. Not everybody knows that, but there were American Jewish expatriates living in Cuba, involved in businesses in Cuba and plantations and companies and growing tourism and so on. And the Jewish American community, this expatriate community that could go back and forth between the US and Cuba, they built the cemetery, the first Jewish cemetery in Cuba, which is very interesting. So the need to have a sacred resting place, right, for the Jewish community. And so the cemetery, this Centro Macabeo on the outskirts of Havana and Guanabacoa gets built. And then later another cemetery gets built that's specifically a Sephardic cemetery in that same town about 15 miles away from Havana. And they bring businesses, as I said, like the very famous Moshe Pipik restaurant, an American Jewish kosher restaurant that arrives in Cuba at this time. But this group was a very small group of residents in Cuba. the majority of the Jews that came to settle in Cuba were immigrants. These were the immigrants that couldn't get into the United States. And so instead, they were going to Cuba. They knew that Cuba was very close to the United States, and many thought they would use Cuba as a kind of trampoline to then come to the United States. But there were many who loved Cuba and said, I don't need to go any further. I will just stay in Cuba. So here are my paternal grandparents, Isaac and Rebecca, my father's parents. They were both immigrants from Turkey. They met in Cuba. He was escaping the Turkish army and she was sent to Cuba to get married and to prosper. And they were both from the town of Silivri. And many, many of the Cuban Sephardic Jews were from Silivri or Istanbul or Çorlu, these towns very close to Istanbul. And I got to go to Silivri years ago in 1992 and picked up this postcard. There wasn't a Jewish community there anymore, but the majority came from this town, from towns in and around Istanbul, and settled in Cuba. So that was the Sephardic side. So I'm Sephardic on my father's side, but I'm Ashkenazi on my mother's side. And so my mother's parents came from Poland and Russia in the 1920s as well. They also met and married in Cuba. And my maternal grandmother, Esther, has a very interesting story. She was the first of 7 children to go to Cuba and meet up with her father, who was already there in Cuba, trying to save up enough money to bring the rest of the family from Poland. And he was having a very difficult time doing that. He was a very religious man, and she came and helped him work and save up to bring the family to Cuba from Poland. And she was from this town of Govorovo, Yiddish speaking. And she was able to help him bring the family to Cuba, her siblings and her mother, who were still back in Poland. And they settled, interestingly enough, they went and settled in the countryside in a small town called Agramonte in the province of Matanzas. Very interesting. They were the only Jewish family there in the 30s. And they were called Los Polacos because there were so many Jews from Poland that to this day in Cuba, the word that people use to describe a Jewish person in Cuba is Polaco. And so they were known as Los Polacos. Then another Jewish family from Poland moved into Agramonte, and they were called Los Polacos Nuevos. But my family were Los Polacos Viejos. Anyway, so they settled in the countryside, which is interesting because I think not everybody knows that there was this Jewish settlement in the countryside, not just in Havana. And anyway, this whole story, my grandmother's story, is in this new book of mine that's coming out on August 25th, Letters from Cuba, if you want to know more about the Jewish Cuban story. But we're going to go back to the Sephardic story now. So back again to my paternal grandparents, Rebecca and Isaac. At this time, they had 3 children. My Aunt Fanny, the youngest, was born later. That little boy in the white outfit is my father. And they settled in Havana. They lived on Calle Oficios, right next to the port of Havana. This is what the building looks like. It looks like a building from medieval Spain, but it's actually Havana. And they lived in a building with many other immigrants who were also from Turkey, many other Jewish immigrants from Turkey, where they could continue speaking Ladino and maintaining customs from the old country. And they were part of a community that created its own synagogue, the Shevet Ahim, founded in 1914. And curiously, the synagogue was founded on Calle del Inquisidor, the street of the Inquisitor, which is kind of comical if you think of this being where Sephardic Jews built their synagogue. And so there was a lively Sephardic community. They went to the Shevet Ahim synagogue. And here, just to show you that this Jewish community that arrives in the teens and 20s and leaves by the early 60s, most of the community, they create many synagogues and Jewish institutions in this very short amount of time. And the Sephardic Jews, many settle in Havana, But also, interestingly, many settle in the eastern part of Cuba, in Oriente, and they have synagogues and Jewish communities in Holguín and Santiago de Cuba and Guantánamo, all throughout the island. And you can see that better here where you've got the map. And so it's so interesting to see that there were these synagogues all over the island. By the 1950s, there were 5 synagogues in Havana, but there were also synagogues in Santa Clara and Camagüey, in Guantánamo, in Santiago de Cuba, and many of them were Sephardic, so that there was this Sephardic presence throughout the island. In Havana, of course, was the core, but many also settled in Oriente, in places like Manzanillo. There were important Sephardic and also Ashkenazi communities. And they formed many schools. Again, in a short amount of time, they really made an effort to be present in the Cuban landscape as Jews, and they formed various schools. The Colegio Teodoro Herzl was a Sephardic day school, and then the Centro Israelita was Ashkenazi, and instruction was in Spanish and Yiddish. So they had many schools. The Academia Perez was very well known. So a lot of education for this Jewish community that by the time the 1950s comes, there were already about 15 to 20,000 Jews in Cuba. So coming back to my family story, my parents meet in Havana in the 1950s. My mother's family eventually leaves the countryside of Matanzas and settles in La Habana. My parents meet, and it's an unusual encounter because she is Ashkenazi and he is Sephardic. And at this time, these two communities were very separate, right? For obvious reasons. The Ashkenazi Jews spoke Yiddish, had a whole culture from Eastern Europe, ate gefilte fish, etc. Sephardic Jews spoke Ladino, different liturgy, different customs. They had lived in Islamic lands for much of their history. So when my parents met, this was very unusual. Both families thought it was unusual, but they fell in love and married, and here they are at their wedding, next to my father, his parents, and next to my mother, her parents, and my great-grandparents, the Yiddish side of the family. And I think this is interesting that they maintain their Ashkenazi and Sephardic difference, but at the same time, by the 1950s, I feel that this represents that they were becoming Cuban. They could be Jewish and Cuban, and it didn't really matter if you were Ashkenazi and Sephardic. They were going to find a way to bridge these differences. And so I am born in Cuba. Here I am as a little girl on the famous Malecón, starting to take in all of these different cultural influences as a very small child. And the 1950s, as you all know, is a period where the US and Cuba are closely related to one another. There was a ferry that you could put your car on back then and go on down to Cuba from Key West, just like you could take, the Staten Island ferry and, go across and take your car. It was that level of close relationship between the two countries that was the Cuba of the 1950s, the Cuba that I was born into. And I just want to show you that there was a huge presence, business presence in Old Havana, La Habana Vieja. This just gives you a sense of all the many Jewish-owned businesses and institutions that existed. And these were all in La Habana Vieja because they were very close to the port. So you could get the goods that you needed from the port and bring them to your shop. There are many Jews owned small businesses, some owned larger businesses, but the business model was very important in the Jewish community of that time. And just to show you, that was Havana, but there were many Jews, both Sephardic and Ashkenazi, and you could see some of the names down here, Behar and Crespin and Chiprut and Canetti, many Sephardic names here of people who owned businesses in Santiago de Cuba on the other end of the island. And so it's very interesting to me that by the mid-1950s, this community is very prosperous and it is creating a Jewish community center, something like a JCC, which we call the Patronato, Casa de la Comunidad Hebrea de Cuba, called the Patronato, very large structure with a synagogue, a banquet hall, library. suggesting that in this period between 52 and 55, the Jewish community was really planning to stay in Cuba, building these major institutions on Cuban soil. And they commissioned Cuba's most important architect at the time, Capablanca, to design this very modernist synagogue in the 50s, very, very modernist design and architecture, with this arch, which symbolizes the sense of, we're going to be here for a long time, reaching to the skies, right? And that synagogue is still there, and as we'll see in a moment, a very important magnet for travelers to Cuba. We lived half a block away from the synagogue, so I was often photographed in front of the synagogue, as you can see here. And while the Ashkenazi Jews built the Patronato, this major Jewish community center, the Sephardic Jews also built, after having the Shevet Ahim, they built a modern synagogue, the Centro Hebreo Sephardi de Cuba. And the interesting thing is they finished it in 1959, just as the revolution was beginning and Fidel Castro coming into power at that time. So it's very interesting. The Jews in Cuba, most were supportive of the revolution in its early moments. They weren't leaving right away. Here you can see this beautiful Haggadah by Rabbi Gambach, who was a very close friend of the family, which is published in 1960. So suggesting that the Jewish community is still there, 59, 60, those first 2 years of the revolution. But then everything changes in 1961 after the Bay of Pigs invasion, April 17 to 19, 1961, because it's after the US tries to invade and bring down the Castro regime. The Castro declares that Cuba is going to follow a socialist path. And many of the Jews become concerned because their properties are nationalized. Many lose their businesses. Many lose their businesses in the morning, and on the afternoon, they're on a flight to Miami. So there was the economic issue of losing your livelihood that they had worked so hard to build. And then there was the religious issue that Cuba was moving towards a secular system and eventually would essentially enforce atheism on the population. And many Jews, of course, were concerned that they would not be able to practice their Jewish traditions. And so they left for those two reasons, not because they were persecuted or treated anti-Semitically, but because of the economic and the religious concerns. And they left with a large part of the middle class population that leaves Cuba between 61 and 62. And in this picture, that woman with the box is my maternal grandmother, Esther, who I have mentioned before. So it's interesting to know that, again, the majority of the Jewish population was Ashkenazi. As I said, the general term for a Jewish person in Cuba to this day is Polaco. And they will call Sephardic Jews Polacos, even though they have nothing to do with Poland, because the majority of the immigration was from Poland. But this 30% was Sephardic. And you can also see that the population reached its height in the late 1940s. Then many left for the US, but there was an important population in the 1950s, about 15,000 Jews. And then that population decreases, really by 1965, it decreases in Cuba to about 2,000 Jews, right? And then now there are about 1,000 people left in the Jewish community, more or less. So what happens? People leave, and they start a new life, a diaspora upon a diaspora. They start a new life in New York and Miami. We go to New York. This is me with my parents and my little brother. And we go to New York. My mother's older sister had married an American Jew from New York. So it seemed logical to go there. And the family resettles in New York. Many of the Sephardic Cubans settled in Canarsie at this time. And a whole new life, an encounter with the snow, with El Norte, a very, very different culture, obviously, from Cuba. And at that time, the World's Fair was going on, and this awareness that's nurtured in me about my Cuban, my Jewish, my Sephardic, my Ashkenazi identity, but also this sense of belonging to something bigger, to this kind of global identity that I got a feeling for at that time as the World's Fair was going on in Cuba. Now, most of the Jews and many in our family who went to New York first, they then moved on to Miami. And as you know, the majority of the Cuban Jewish community settled in Miami with the rest of the Cuban community and the Cuban exiles. And this is Bernardo Benes, who many of you may have heard of, who died recently this past year. And he was very, very active in the Cuban Jewish community and also very active in trying to release political prisoners from Cuba. And he came up with this term Juban, right? And to this day in Miami, what's so interesting is when I go to Miami, I don't have to explain that I'm Jewish and I'm Cuban. People go, yeah, you're a Juban, right? This term has developed to describe this mixture of identities. And it's very interesting that the two communities, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic community, they both built synagogues in Miami Beach. The Ashkenazi Jews built the Cuban Hebrew, and you get a sense of it here, remembering the patronato that I mentioned before, the Jewish Community Center, in memory of that patronato that they had built in the 50s and had had to abandon so quickly, with the picture and everything of the patronato. And then the Sephardic Cubans build Temple Moses for a little further up in Miami Beach, still in existence and a very lively congregation. And so they built Temple Moses, and I find this so interesting. The plaque at the entrance to the synagogue speaks to the fact that it was founded in 1968 by Cuban Jewish refugees forced into exile during the early 60s, which to me seems reminiscent of the expulsion from Spain, the sense of being forced. They felt they were forced to leave and go into exile. We will never forget what we left behind on the island of Cuba, right? So the sense that this new temple is going to hold on to the memory of Cuba, very, very powerful. And in the temple, the women on Tuesdays, pre-pandemic, every Tuesday they make borrecas and bulemas and bizcochos that they sell to support their community. And they're delicious, by the way. And the men continue to play dominoes, just like in Cuba, as you see here. And I also, in going to one of the cemeteries in Miami, I found this grave dedicated to Marcos Behar, not my relative, Abuelo Papi, el rey del dominó en nuestro corazón siempre. And to me, that was so powerful that they had left these domino pieces on his tombstone, right, as a remembrance. And not many people in the Sephardic Cuban community have gone back to Cuba to visit, but some have. And I just want to share this picture of Moreno Habib, who was Sephardic and Ashkenazi as well. And he took his children and grandchildren to Cuba on a trip to kind of see, the Cuba that he remembered. They took a picture in front of the Tropicana nightclub, very powerful, because a few years later he passed away. So he had this opportunity to share this memory with his family. So I started to return to Cuba in the early 90s. I was very curious about Cuba. I'm an anthropologist by training. I had done research in Spain and Mexico. I'm very interested in the Spanish-speaking world and in Sephardic culture. And I really wanted to go to Cuba and see it with my own eyes. And when I started going, initially I was just trying to stand in the same places where I stood as a child, as you can see here, and just kind of trying to recuperate, in a sense, these places that had been lost. And it was a very interesting time when I started going back in the 1990s. This, of course, is after the fall of the former Soviet Union. And it's a moment of return to religion, when the Cuban government declares that people can have a religious affiliation and still be a member of the Communist Party. So in this picture, you get that interesting sense that people are trying to negotiate the revolutionary identity with the religious identity, as you see in this picture. And there was a lot of curiosity outside of Cuba about Fidel and the Jews, because there had been no persecution of the Jews, the small community that stayed behind on the island. They hadn't been persecuted the way Jews had been in the former Soviet Union. So that was interesting. And the other thing that was interesting is that there was and still is a kosher butcher shop in Old Havana that never closed down after the revolution. So there was this awareness that Jews had these different dietary customs and that it was necessary for them to be able to get kosher meat. So all of these things made Cuba an interesting place. And there was some speculation that perhaps Castro was even of Sephardic ancestry himself. So the 90s was this complex time. People were returning to religion. People were struggling because there were shortages of food, shortages of electricity, and many people were trying to leave Cuba any way they could. But at the same time, that was the period when American Jews and other Americans started traveling to Cuba out of curiosity to see what is this place that is so taboo that we've heard so much about. And many began to bring aid and support to the Jewish community. The Jewish community had basically fallen apart during the 60s and 70s and 80s. People remembered they were Jewish. There was a Passover package that would come from the Canadian Jewish Congress every year, and people would go pick up this package, but they weren't going to synagogue. Very, very few people. Only a few elders were really maintaining the traditions. But in the 90s, when it was okay again to have a religious affiliation and be part of the Cuban society, many began to rediscover their Jewish roots, and many American Jews began to help this community revitalize. And so a lot of aid started coming into Cuba in the 90s and through to almost to the present. And here you see in this article, this sense of we need to help the Jews in Cuba. And so many trips to Cuba were developed, and many American Jews throughout the 90s and the 2000s traveled to Cuba to see and to witness this Jewish community on the island, this revitalization of the Jewish community on the island. And many go to the Patronato that I mentioned before, the Jewish Community Center. This is like a pilgrimage site that people go to get kind of their first encounter of what's left of the Jewish presence in Cuba. And this is the interior of the sanctuary, a very large sanctuary because the community was very large at that point with 15,000. Now there's a community of 1,000. So they left behind these large synagogues that now are taken care of by this very tiny community that's left. Adela Dworin is a very important person in the community. She's the president of the Jewish community. She is Ashkenazi, obviously. She speaks Spanish, Yiddish, English, and she is the one that greets many of the visitors that come through Cuba. Rosa Behar, not my relative, she played a very interesting role. These American Jews were bringing a lot of medical aid to Cuba, and so the Patronato basically has a pharmacy where they gather all of these medical donations and then give them out to people who need them with prescriptions and so on. And for a time, they were getting so many donations that many of these additional medications that the community didn't need would then get donated to hospitals all over Cuba. Rosa is a gastroenterologist. And so these groups of American Jews began to travel to Cuba, many of them going to these sites that were part of my Jewish memory, like the cemetery that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, and discovering partly that some of the tombstones were in a very bad state of decay because the relatives of these people were no longer on the island, and there was a sense of the Jewish community almost in pieces and fragments, as you see in this image, but also many new tombstones for those that have passed away recently, like Luis Lapidus, and this is a very interesting tombstone because it represents both the Jewish star and the communist star together on his tombstone. So this bringing together of a revolutionary and a Jewish identity. And I wanted to share Julio Eli's story as well because it's very powerful. He lives in Caibarien, a fishing town about 4 or 5 hours away from Havana. And his family had stores there in Caibarien that were taken away from the family after the revolution. And he told me this very moving story of his younger sister, Violeta, who died in 1977 at the age of 22. She was studying biology at the University of Havana. Most of his family had left Cuba, but they had stayed, and she became very ill with leukemia and died. And it was just a devastating thing for the family. His father in particular was very devastated by the loss of his daughter. And at the time, this was the 1970s, there was a Jewish cemetery in Santa Clara, but that was some distance away from Caibarien, and the cemetery wasn't being properly looked after. So they were very concerned about where to bury Violeta, this girl that had died too young. And the father, Julio's father, decided, he was a Freemason, and he was able to get a plot in the Catholic cemetery of Caibarien as a Freemason. And he got this plot of land, and he, in a sense, created a mini Jewish cemetery within the Catholic cemetery, put a Jewish star there. And that's where he buried his daughter, so he could go to her grave frequently in Caibarien. It's a very moving story, but also shows how Jews at that time had to figure out what to do in a situation where the Jewish community didn't really exist as such at the time. And then later the father and the mother passed away, and they were all buried in this crypt in this little nook, this niche within the Catholic cemetery of Caibarien. So I think a very interesting Sephardic story. So I was documenting as an anthropologist, learning what people had held onto of Jewish identity. And so finding that, Albertico, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, had this kippah from 1959 that had, come into his possession. There was a talit that his grandfather had brought from Turkey. So all of these things had been saved in the 60s and 70s and 80s into the 90s. During this time of revolution. They had held on to these things. They couldn't use them really, but they held on to them. They treated them as sacred things. And surprising to find the wine cups and the Shabbat candle holders left by other Jews would be passed on to those who were still on the island. The mezuzah, an electricity bill that would come into the name of a Jewish person who no longer lived on the island. And then Jewish documents like the ketubah. And this is a very interesting story that belonged to a Turkish abuela in the 1920s. And Sara, who is Sephardic, told me the story that this ketubah belonged to her grandmother. And in the 90s, when it became possible to be publicly Jewish again, publicly religious again, many Jews started leaving for Israel. It became possible in this time to make aliyah to Israel. And so many decided to leave at this time, but they had to prove they were Jewish. And so they needed Jewish documents. And she discussed with me how this ketubah became a kind of passport for her son, her daughter, a nephew, her brother, all these family members that sadly were leaving Cuba and leaving her and her husband behind on their own in Havana. And she also shared, as many people did, these old photographs, and again, very moving. She told me that this was the last quinceañera held at the Patronato Synagogue in 1959. And she said, of all those young women who turned 15 in 1959, I'm the only one still in Cuba. So the sense of being shipwrecked, of being among the few still holding on to a Jewish identity. In Cuba, I was very moved by the story of Daniel Eskenazi Maya, Sephardic Jew. Both his parents were from Turkey. And interestingly, in his case, he wasn't that into Sephardic documents, but he was hugely into tango. He loved the Argentine tango, and he had this kind of altar to Carlos Gardel and would sing tangos, and there were these tango clubs that he would go to and sing. And I thought that was so interesting that in a sense, his Sephardic identity was expressed through this nostalgia for the tango, even though he had never left Cuba, he had never traveled outside of the island, but he would sing songs about Buenos Aires, a place he'd never been to. So another very kind of powerful way, I think, to be Sephardic in the present. Anyway, these stories, if you're interested, can be found in my book, An Island Called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba, and in the Spanish translation, Una Isla Llamada Hogar, if you want to know more about these stories. Now I'm going to end with the Sephardic stories from Adiós Querida. Some of you may have seen the movie, but I imagine many of you have not, and you can see the movie afterwards if this is interesting to you. I have some clips from the movie, but I don't think I'm going to have time. I think I'm just going to tell the stories quickly to you so that we can go through the whole PowerPoint and then we can discuss. So this is a movie that I made. It came out in 2002, so it's almost 20 years old. Adiós Querida, Cuban-American woman's search for Sephardic memories. And it's the first movie about Cuban Sephardic Jews, as far as I know. And I dedicated the film to my father, and who you see here, Alberto Behar. And I decided to dedicate the film to him because I'm Sephardic through my father. And he has never returned to Cuba, but I have been back, and I wanted to show the connection to Sephardic Cuban identity by going to Cuba and making this film for him and showing that there's still a Sephardic presence on the island, that not everything is gone. There's still something of our presence is still there. And in the movie, he and I and my mother, actually, we go to the Shevet Ahim part of the cemetery in New Jersey. This is a whole area of the cemetery that was purchased by the Sephardic Cubans when they settled in New York. And this is where my grandparents that you saw earlier in the presentation, my Sephardic grandparents, Rebecca and Isaac, are buried in this cemetery that is an extension of the Shevet Ahim synagogue or Shevet Ahim community from Cuba. And you see me there placing a stone at my grandmother's grave. And so I can tell you much more later if you like during the Q&A. I've written stories and poems about my Sephardic identity. One of these stories is called Un cierto aire Sephardi, a Sephardi air, and it's about growing up with these two, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic identity, but always being seen as Sephardic, me by my Ashkenazi family because of my dark hair and dark eyebrows and so on. I was always seen as Sephardic, even though I actually grew up very close to the Ashkenazi family. So having this Sephardi air has been very much a part of my own identity. And so I went searching to see, who are my community in Cuba, who is left of the Sephardic culture. And this is a beautiful handmade book that was made in Cuba by an artist named Rolando Esteves with this story of mine handmade. So I went to Cuba and I spent a lot of time with the Sephardic community that was there at the time. It's now been changing. And I learned that there were 9 Torahs that were brought from Turkey. And here they are. And I met so many interesting people of diverse Sephardic Cuban identities on the island. This child, who I have known since she was about 3 years old, Danaida, I met her and met her father, and it was very, very interesting. So she's Afro-Cuban and Sephardic Cuban. She's holding a teddy bear that was donated by an American Jewish group that was visiting. And she was and is very, very close to her father, Jose Levy. And Jose Levy played a very important role in the 90s and 2000s in bringing together the Sephardic community of Cuba. She grew up very, very close to her father. She was brought up as a Sephardic Jew by her father. And here you can see that she spent a lot of time in the Centro Hebreo Sephardi de Cuba. And but her mother is Afro-Cuban, and her mother is a Jehovah's Witness. But her mother had no objection to Danaida being brought up as a Sephardic Jew by her father. So her parents divorced when she was very little, and they lived in the same building. And so she would spend a lot of time with both parents, but mostly lived with her mom and then would go with her father to the synagogue. And when I was making the movie, Jose Levy was preparing Danaida for her bat mitzvah, as you see here. And I thought that was very special that he was teaching her Hebrew and preparing her to be able to read from the Torah. And several years later, she made the decision that she really wanted to leave for Israel, that Israel was where she belonged. And we photographed her just as she was waiting for her visa to come in from Israel. The Israeli government at this time was supporting Jews in Cuba who wanted to immigrate and make aliyah to Israel, supporting them by purchasing their plane tickets and passports and visa, providing housing to them in Israel and a stipend and Hebrew classes upon arrival in Israel. And she was waiting very impatiently at that time to be able to leave for Israel. A sad situation because her mother wouldn't be going. Her mother is not Jewish. And she got to Israel with her father. She met her husband while she was working in Spain for a year selling Dead Sea products. He's from the Dominican Republic, and they married and settled in Israel. And they now have two daughters. And here you can see Danaida and her husband. She goes by the name Debbie Levy. Now they are, of course, totally fluent in Hebrew. They live Israeli lives, but at the same time, very connected to their Cuban identity, speak Cuban and Dominican identity, speak Spanish, and have that whole Caribbean connection and making a new life in Israel. Similarly, Miguelito, another very interesting story, also Afro-Cuban boy with a Sephardic past, and his mother is Sephardic. And when I met him, he loved to drum, and he would drum on the buckets that they used to fill up with warm water from the stove to be able to take a bath, because they didn't have running water in the shower. And then these buckets, when they weren't being used for the bath, these were his drums, and he was really into drumming as a young boy, and we filmed him drumming. And he also dreamed of going to Israel and making Aliyah. And soon after the filming, he and his mother and sister left for Israel, where he now lives as well. And I have visited with him, as I have with Danaida, twice. And there was a moment when he had given up music, and I thought, oh my God, he's going to give up music when he's obviously such a talented musician. But then he came back to music. He goes by Miguel de Ritmo now, and you can see him, very accomplished musician and percussionist. And here he is with his mom and his sister, all living in Israel and in Hadera and Tel Aviv. So that's all extremely interesting. Now going back to those Sephardic Jews that have stayed on the island, I mentioned Albertico before. His name is Albert Behar, just like my father, Albertico Behar. And he has a very interesting story. So he grew up with a Sephardic grandfather who was religious, who spoke Ladino, and then his father was revolutionary, and his father didn't want any kind of religious belief in their household. But when his father was dying, a few months before his death, his father asked Albertico if he would bury him in the Jewish cemetery in Guanabacoa. And Alberto says, but why? You've never been religious. You're a revolutionary. And he said, I know, but I want to be buried in the Jewish cemetery where my parents are buried. And so they buried his father in the Jewish cemetery. And Albertico talks about this, that he was there, and Abraham Berezniak, who was a very religious Jew, who really kind of kept a lot of the religious customs going, he said to him, well, you're going to have to recite a Kaddish. And this was back in the 80s. And Albertico didn't know what a Kaddish was, because he'd been so disconnected from Judaism. And he didn't say the Kaddish because he didn't know what a Kaddish was, and he didn't want to just say something by rote. But that experience really made an impact on him. And after that, he went on a spiritual journey, and he learned to chant Torah. And he's the one who prepares the kids for their bar and bat mitzvahs in Cuba today. I really wanted to share a video clip of my cousin Isaquito. He tells wonderful stories. He's in Miami. He remembers a lot of my family's life in Cuba and Cayo Oficios, and how the building where they lived was filled with Sephardic Jews, but also with Santeros practicing Afro-Cuban religions. Anyway, he has a lot of wonderful stories. So the stories have been held on to by many. Susana Behar, who is an amazing, accomplished singer of Sephardic songs, lives in Miami. We're not related, but she sings the Sephardic songs in Adio Querida. Sami also appears in Adio Querida, fascinating man. He's a hairstylist, grew up with a Sephardic grandfather in Chicago, Sephardic Cuban grandfather, becomes a hairstylist, and he talks about tolerance and the importance of tolerating different religions and different customs. Very, very fascinating story in the film. The Habibs, Elsa and Alberto Habib, unfortunately Alberto has since passed away, and they have a store in downtown Miami where they sell all of these wonderful Turkish good luck amulets, evil eye protection, and so on. Elsa is still alive and has kept up the store. So another way to be Sephardic. And I want to mention Miriam and her brother, Raphael Eli. Very, very moving story. Miriam has held on to her Sephardic identity. She's Sephardic on her father's side, Ashkenazi on her mother's, just like me. And she is a very much an expert in Middle Eastern dance and has studied the music and the dance throughout her career. And I want to mention her brother, Raphael, Rafi Eli, who also appears in the movie and tells some very interesting stories of his research on Jews persecuted by the Inquisition, including many who have his last name, De Eli. And he talks about this in the movie, and he also talks about this picture that he held on to of himself and other children in 1959 when Fidel Castro had come into power, and they were dressed like little Fidelistas, right, with the Israeli flag and the Cuban flag. His story is so powerful. And unfortunately, I'm also saying this as a memorial to Raphael Ali, to Rafi Ali, who died of COVID-19 on April 16th. And a story about him and others appeared in the New York Times, where this is an article about things left behind by people who passed away in the hospital at this time, and about Miriam's efforts to recover these belongings. As you see here, and here's Miriam with her brother Raphael. So even Sephardic Cuban Jews have been affected by the pandemic, and I wanted to share that with all of you. So I'm going to just briefly now conclude and to say that, so today, the Sephardic Cuban community continues on the island. This is Maida Levy, a medical doctor who is now the president of the Sephardic community in Cuba, very small community. Here she is in the office of the synagogue. She worked really hard to bring this Holocaust exhibit, which is in the main sanctuary of the Sephardic synagogue in Havana, and many school children in Cuba go to visit this exhibit and to learn about the Holocaust. There's a lot of Holocaust consciousness in Cuba now, in the sense that this community, though small, belongs to the global Jewish community, the hashtag We Remember. Here at the Patronato, you see many of the teachers, because the Jewish community has a Sunday school. They don't have a rabbi, but they have a Sunday school, and all of these people are lay instructors who teach Hebrew, who teach Jewish history, and teach on all levels. They teach from children to adults. Here's Fidel Babani, a Sephardic Jew, holding up a gefilte fish donated by one of the American Jewish organizations. And the community continues to receive donations from the Joint Distribution Committee, B'nai B'rith, Argentine organizations as well, that help support this community. But at the same time, it's a very independent community. And in recent years, they've begun to hold very large Jewish festivals, like a Hanukkah party that they invited leaders of other religious organizations to be there. You can see this very large Cuban flag. This is at the Patronato Synagogue, but the Israeli flag is there as well. They have their own dance group, Rikudim dance group, and they put on these large performances to get the young people involved in the Jewish community. When I was there earlier this year, I spoke to many of the young people in the community about my research. And so Cuba is interesting. They've been seeking a path towards tourism in recent years, which now, of course, with the pandemic is impossible to maintain, because people aren't traveling to Cuba. We're not traveling really anywhere. But here you can see how the Jewish community became part of this kind of tourist package in Cuba. Adath Israel, which is another synagogue I didn't mention, which is an Orthodox synagogue in Old Havana, Anacosta y Picota, for those of you that know La Habana Vieja, they became involved as well in creating kippahs and other Jewish things to sell to American Jewish visitors, as you see here. And it's interesting that with the growth of tourism, the whole fashion industry also went to Cuba and used Havana in particular is a kind of backdrop for fashion shoots, as you see in this picture. There are a lot of new restaurants and bars and boutiques that have been created as well, very hipstery kinds of places. And I just want to end by reminding you, I mentioned that the Jews spread out all over the island. And to this day, there are Jews living in the provincial cities of Cuba. This is David Tacher, who lives in Santa Clara. And he was involved in creating a Holocaust memorial in the cemetery, in the Jewish cemetery of Santa Clara. And again, many school children, Cuban school children, go and visit this memorial and learn about the Holocaust. So he's done a very important work of outreach to the larger Cuban community. And he fundraised to build a new synagogue because the old synagogue in Santa Clara had closed during the revolutionary years, and he was very sad about that. And he fundraised to create a new synagogue in Santa Clara. They're all Sephardic. Here are the people you see in this picture. And you can see the symbol here of the menorah, the Jewish star, on top of the island of Cuba. And this is very interesting. There is a Sephardic Jewish community in Guantanamo. We associate Guantanamo with the US naval base, but there's a Jewish community there in a large city, a large Cuban city, Guantanamo. And these are all descendants of two Mizrahi brothers that settled in Guantanamo in the early part of the 20th century. And here you can see, so everybody is related in some way. And they have a synagogue. Rodolfo Mizrahi in the red t-shirt has a synagogue on top of his house. So it's kind of like a synagogue in La Azotea, you know, on the rooftop of his house. And that's where they meet and maintain Jewish traditions. And just to end here, and here you can see the very different phenotypes of young members of the Jewish community today, a community that's much more racially and ethnically diverse than it was before the revolution. So these children are the future of this Jewish community that we hope will continue to exist in Cuba. And just by way of conclusion, I don't know that I was able to really make this point fully here, but I wanted to show the Sephardim from an anthropological perspective. I feel that too often the Sephardim are perceived, and we perceive ourselves as people with too much history. We're portrayed as bearers of memory, as people who hold on to the melancholy of the expulsion from Spain in 1492. We're often seen as preserving culture rather than innovating on culture, and we appear to kind of lack a modern identity. We sort of remain elusive and hidden. And through this study, I want to show that that's not really the case, that we have a very modern identity. Though certainly we have a deep sense of history, but we're also very much alive in the present. Most of the scholarship focuses on the medieval past leading up to 1492, many studies of the Inquisition, many studies of crypto-Jews. We have a wonderful growing literature on the 15th to the early 20th century examining Jewish dispersion, especially to countries of the former Ottoman Empire. So all of that's very important, but we have very little anthropological work. And in the last 100 years, most of the Sephardim have settled in the US and Latin America and Israel, but we know little about their contemporary sense of self. Who are the Sephardic Jews today? What are their life stories? How do they fit, or how do we fit into an ever more complex world? And I hope that listening to these stories today from Cuba, that I've been able to give you some sense of how we fit into this complex world, how we hold on to a Sephardic identity in many different kinds of ways. It's almost as if we have a mosaic of identities and hold on to them, but also find ways to be very much alive in the present as well. So thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Behar. An amazing talk, as so many of us have seen before, with her amazing literature and stories that she's brought to the Sephardic and the wider Jewish world. So thank you so much for that. I'll ask if anybody has any questions, you type them into the chat box and we'll read them out to ask Professor Behar. And to start off, I have a personal question for you. And I was actually very fascinated because you're an anthropologist, you come with a very unique perspective comparative to other major academics and historians, right, in the field. I'm thinking, Professor Devanar, linguists like Dr. Brian Kirshen. and Aaron Rodriguez, etc., who have really focused on Sephardic Judaism from kind of a historic perspective, but haven't talked about today. And, you know, a lot of what we're doing at the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood is trying to figure out what does a modern, engaged Sephardic community look like for the 21st century. I'm curious, maybe you can comment a little bit of where we are today, what you've seen, because you've obviously interacted with the New York Sephardic community, with the Miami Sephardic community, and others. How would you perceive that as an anthropologist?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. That's great. And so as anthropologists, we have to basically hang out with people. That's what we do. We spend a lot of time with people. Our method is called participant observation. So we're supposed to somehow both participate and observe at the same time. So be part, but also be a little bit separate so we can kind of get a sense of what's going on. And that's our methodology. And that's what I did in Cuba. And that's what I've done as well in Miami, New York, Seattle. Also did a little bit of field work there. Our method is field work. It's kind of an antiquated term for what we do because we're not actually doing anything in a field. Um, but so spending a lot of time with people and just kind of hanging out and you know, and yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. And I feel that that's what you're doing with the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood, is trying to create kind of this new Sephardic identity. Like, who are we today? And it's important to know our history, but we shouldn't just only know our history. We should also kind of carve an identity that's very much of the present as well. And I think one of the things that has really been striking for me is that I feel that Sephardic Jews have a lot of practice in being in multilingual and multicultural settings. You know, our history gives us that in a sense. And so I think we have a very good sense of that because many of us speak, and I didn't get to talk enough about Ladino and Spanish. I was hoping to do that with the film clips, but many of us, say the Sephardic Jews who went to Cuba, they spoke Ladino, but eventually they became Spanish speakers, right? But they still have the Ladino as well, and they had that Spanish, and they were able to find a way to fit into Cuba. So the way in which many of us can feel that we fit within the Latino community in the US, because we have Spanish, we have Ladino, we have a Spanish inheritance, right? And so it gives us the possibility of fitting into many more communities. I think that makes us very versatile and gives us a very fluid identity. I know that I personally can feel totally comfortable among Cubanos, among Latinos from Argentina, from Mexico. I mean, I have this sense, this fluidity of identity. I think that's something that many Sephardic Jews have because, you know, we have various languages. You know, certainly our ancestors had even more, I would say, because I know that my paternal grandparents spoke Turkish and French and Ladino and, you know, Spanish, and, you know, they had many, many languages that they could communicate in. And but I think we do too. So I think one of the aspects of our identity is this kind of versatility, this multilingualism, this multiculturalism that makes us kind of fit in many different sorts of places, but also makes us unique when we come together, because it's like, wow, you know, we have the Turkish background, some of us have the Cuban background, and then the American background. We bring all of those things together. And what I found striking, and that's why I use the image of the mosaic, is that I feel that the Sephardic Jews that I met from Cuba, each of them found a different thing that they wanted to kind of focus on in their Sephardic self-creation, right? So that Miriam Eli, it was the dance, you know, it was she literally embodies Sephardic culture by dancing, right? Dancing this Middle Eastern dance that her ancestors might have danced, or at least have appreciated, or even have seen much later on in Turkey, right? So she does it that way. Others have moved into research, so that her brother, may he rest in peace, Rafi Ali, was very into research, and he had books and books and books about the Inquisition. So for him, it was researching the history, right? So different people have found different ways to kind of, you know, hook into this identity to make it relevant to their lives today.
Amazing. I was wondering if you could actually comment a little bit on the Ladino aspect, because we actually have quite a number of questions about this. Did Sephardim, when they came to Cuba, continue to speak Ladino? Did it, I mean, you alluded to this, did it blend into Spanish? How is it kind of influenced by Yiddish as well? Can you maybe comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. And I had these wonderful clips that I wanted, video clips, but I didn't want to go over time. So yes, so there's a clip where Roberto Behar, an old friend of my father's who's still in Cuba, he talks about how his grandmother, who was, a Sephardic Jew from Turkey, that she would go to the grocery and ask for things in Ladino. She'll go, quiero dos ocas. Dos ocas de azúcar. And he would go as the little grandson, he'd go there, no, abuela, no oca, libras, 2 libras de azúcar. She would go, no, 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 ellos me entienden, dos ocas, and so definitely my father's generation, they had the Ladino speaking parents, right, who arrived in Cuba. And by the way, the Sephardic Jews, many of them chose to go to Cuba. They didn't treat Cuba as a trampoline to get to the United States eventually. They wanted to go to Cuba because they had Ladino, and they go, well, we have the Ladino, we're going to be able to communicate with people in Cuba. And so they went with the Ladino, and they were very confident. I think that example shows they were very confident that they would be understood, that they could say dos ocas de azúcar, and somehow people in Cuba would understand this, when they were using Ladino. In the clip with my cousin Isaquito that I would have loved to have shown as well, because it's hilarious. He's very, very funny. He talks about living in this building on Calle Oficios, and, all the Sephardic people were on one floor. On the other floor were the santeros, killing chickens and roosters and, offering the blood to the saints and so on. But then there was a floor where the prostitutas lived. The prostitutes lived in that building too. But he used a word in Turkish, orospu, right? He goes, orospu. And so that had somehow peppered into his Spanish, which I thought was so fascinating, right? So they had the Ladino, and that made it easier for Sephardic Jews to blend in and be able to communicate, unlike the Ashkenazi Jews who spoke Yiddish and Polish and Russian, etc. It was much harder for them to learn Spanish. They had often, as I know from my Ashkenazi family, they often had very thick, accents, thick, European accents speaking Spanish. But the Sephardic Jews also had an accent, but it was a different kind of accent. They had the Ladino accent, but they could be understood. And they were able to fit in more quickly because they had Ladino, and they also had dark features that made them, look more like Cubans. And so they were able to kind of blend in more, and in many ways I think, to become more a part of Cuban society. It's interesting that today the Sephardic Jews that remain in Cuba, not all, but many of them are men. So they're Sephardic on the man's side, and they marry women not Jewish who then convert to Judaism. And so that it's interesting that I feel that many of the men in an earlier period blended in so much to Cuban life that they married outside of the Jewish tribe, married women who weren't Jewish, and now it's their children and grandchildren that have become part of this Jewish community, which I should mention is mainly a community of Jews by choice. Many of them are converts who have converted after marrying someone of Jewish heritage. So that's also interesting, because we know that conversos and conversion is very much a part of the Sephardic legacy as well. So we kind of see a modern version of it, right, in Cuba today. Now, it's interesting. I was talking to my Aunt Fanny about this, about my grandparents speaking Ladino, and then she and my father, speaking Spanish, of course, because they were born in Cuba. And I was saying, bueno, pero ellos hablaban Ladino. She goes, no, 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 ellos hablaban español. So she doesn't use the word Ladino. She said, no, no, ellos hablaban español, pero era otro español. And they learned to speak the Cuban Spanish. So I think that's interesting, that unlike the Sephardic Jews that came straight to the United States, as Devin Narr described in his talk with his family, they were able to get past the whole issue of the limitations on immigration at that time, and they were able to come to the United States. But families like mine that couldn't and went to Cuba instead, they held on to Ladino, but they also became their Ladino became Cubanized, we might say, and they learned to speak what my aunt was describing as kind of more proper Spanish, right? She was kind of thinking that Ladino was kind of not a proper Spanish and that they had learned a more proper Spanish in Cuba.
And you also alluded to this as well just now. Maybe you can speak a little bit about how the Cuban culture kind of influenced the Jewish religious practices in Cuba, both pre-Castro and post-Castro.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. And, and I explored it a little bit with the two children, the two young people in Adio Querida, Danaida and Miguelito. So with Miguelito, you see him playing the drums and, he's playing, Afro-Cuban drum beats, which he continues to play in Israel now, beats like Wawanko, very old Cuban beats that come from the African heritage that in fact were brought by enslaved Africans to Cuba. And that's like the drumming is part of their religion. It's not just music. And so, for example, that part of the culture has been transmitted to him, right, through his father, who's Afro-Cuban, not Jewish. And that's become part of his culture as a Jewish person, a Sephardic Jew who now lives in Israel, right, and brings that culture to Israel. And then Danaida's story is interesting in a similar way. I didn't get to show that clip, which is also so wonderful. And there we see her mother talking about their family and how the mother is a Jehovah's Witness. Danaida was brought up Jewish, Sephardic Jewish by her father, and then her older half-sister, the child of a different father, her older half-sister is a santera, right? And practices Afro-Cuban religiosity and is a singer and musician who eventually left actually for Poland and now lives in Uzbekistan, interestingly enough, while Danaida lives in Israel. And so to me, that was so interesting, the idea of this family where these three women were living together, a mother and two daughters, and each woman in that household had a different religion. And I thought that could only happen in Cuba. It was like a level of, in a sense, it might seem like, to use a Yiddish expression, it might seem a little mashugana to have like three religions in one house, a little crazy. But I also thought it was like a mark of Cuban tolerance. And I think that that's one of the things that has struck me so much about Cuban culture from all my years in touch with this culture and going to Cuba, that there's a lot of tolerance for difference, for social and cultural difference. I'll tell you that I did research in Spain first and then in Mexico as an anthropologist. I lived for several years in a little village in northern Spain. I lived in a town in central Mexico for several years. And both in Spain and Mexico, I never told people I was Jewish. They assumed, because I was Latina, because was a fluent Spanish speaker, that I was probably like them, probably Catholic. And I tended not to announce my Jewishness to people in Spain and Mexico. Spain and Mexico are now different, I should say. I'm talking about the 70s and 80s, a very different time than today when I was doing my field work. Now, of course, in Spain, there's so much interest in the Sephardic past, but at that time, that was after the Franco period. It was a very, very different time. And I was very careful. I felt like I was a hidden Jew. I was not announcing my Jewishness to people. But then I went to Cuba and I felt such a breath of fresh air. Like I didn't have to hide that I was Jewish in Cuba, even, under its communist system. I mean, it was like, oh, you're Jewish. Great. Well, tell us more about it, and I've been so just incredibly impressed with that sense of tolerance and just seeing how the Jewish community is treated in Cuba today and the curiosity that non-Jewish Cubans have, the warmth with which everybody is treated. And I think that sense of tolerance comes, I believe, from the African tradition, which is very strong in Cuba, because Cuba was the next to the last country to abolish slavery in 1886. Brazil was last in 1888, which meant that many enslaved Africans were brought to Cuba into the 19th century. And people, these are largely Yoruba people from West Africa, they don't have the anti-Semitic beliefs, for example, of the Catholic Church. And there's such a strong presence in Cuba of people with this African heritage who don't have anti-Semitism as part of their religious history. And I think that's one of the reasons that there's a lot of tolerance towards difference in Cuba. And I think that sense of kind of live and let live and coexisting religiously and in terms of cultural beliefs is something that I think is very present in Cuban culture. And I think that has had an influence on the Jewish community that exists on the island today. I think also we see it in the Cuban Jewish community in Miami, and you see it in Temple Moses. I mean, you see how in this very short period of time between the 1910s and the 1960s, that's 40 or 50 years, in that short period of time, these Jews that settled in Cuba came to feel so Cuban, that they have to dance the cha-cha-cha at a bar mitzvah. They can't imagine not or not having a conga line. At every bar mitzvah I grew up going to, and every wedding, you had to have a conga line. How could you not have a conga line? I mean, so they kind of, they absorbed this Cuban culture, but I don't think they would have absorbed it if that Cuban culture hadn't also been open to them. And so I think that's one of the things that makes this a very interesting and very unique community.
We have another question here. First, thank you so much for the wonderful talk from one of the commenters. Could you maybe speak a little bit about some of the racial and class and religious identities and tensions before the revolution under Batista, and how the Jewish communities related those tensions, including whether or not Jews were actually involved with the revolution, were they involved with the government, and how those kind of tensions played out?
Yeah, so this is interesting. There were definitely Jews involved with the revolution. The Cuban Communist Party, founded in 1925, one of the key founders was a Polish Jew, actually, who went by the name Fabio Grobart. And he and others were involved in the founding of the Communist Party, which is very interesting. And there were so many Jews of Yiddish background in 1925 who were communists that when the Communist Party was founded, many of them had just arrived in Cuba. They didn't speak Spanish yet, and they had to have a Yiddish Spanish translator at the first meeting of this Communist Party in Cuba. So I think that's very interesting. And there were several of these Jews of Ashkenazi background who were involved with the Communist Party, who were involved with the revolution. Very well-known person, Enrique Oltuski, also Ashkenazi, was involved with the revolution. He fought with Che Guevara. He was from Santa Clara and was a close friend of Fidel Castro's. I met Enrique Oltuski many, many years ago before he passed away. So there was that presence. There were some Sephardic Jews involved as well, interestingly enough. I showed a picture of Fidel Babani with holding some gefilte fish. And I don't know if you remember that, with the bottle of gefilte fish. I know you saw a lot of images just now, and very interesting. He's a Sephardic Jew, and he was a personal bodyguard to Fidel Castro. And then he retired and decided to explore, his Jewish identity. So there's that. There were other Sephardic Jews similarly involved, in the revolution, less involved now, but many of them were in its heyday. So that's interesting that exists, though there are and were many Jews in Cuba who simply stayed on the island, not because they were revolutionary, but simply because they didn't have the means to leave, or they didn't have connections or family abroad that could help them leave the country. So some of them wanted to leave and couldn't. Others, because they had married out of the Jewish community, felt more Cuban than Jewish. And so there were those who stayed as well. Back in the 50s and really up to not so long ago, up until I would say the 80s in the United States, it was looked down upon, it was frowned upon in the Jewish community to marry outside of the Jewish community. And I found that many of those who married out in that period, in the 40s and 50s, many of them eventually felt exiled from the Jewish community and stopped being part of it. And so I think that was an issue. Some married, particularly men, married women of color. And that also was not always positively looked well upon by the Jewish community. So there was definitely, as there was in the United States as well, of course, in the Jewish community, there was racism and this desire to maintain a certain kind of white, background, white European background within the Jewish community. So I think all of those issues were definitely part of the pre-59 community. And I think the interesting thing we see post 59 and post 90s, the community that I saw is this community that's racially mixed, that has people of many, many different backgrounds. Many of those that enter the community through conversion talk about how they didn't really have a religion before. Many will say to me, well, yeah, my family was of Catholic background, but we never practiced anything because, it was atheism that was enforced upon us. So I didn't really have a religion. And it was when I converted that I acquired a religion, that I acquired Judaism. And as we know, converts often are kind of more, much more involved in the religion than those just born into it who take it for granted. And so I think the role of the converts in this community has been very important, though there are several Jews, I would say maybe about a dozen or maybe 15, who are Jewish on their mother's and father's side in Cuba, but most of the community is mixed. And I think that sense of being mixed allows them, again, to both connect with their Jewishness, but also connect with the wider, Cuban mainstream, because they're a part of it too.
We have time for just one or two more questions. We have one question here. Are the Spanish-speaking non-Sephardic Jews kind of puzzled, or just Spanish-speaking Cubans, are they puzzled by Ladino, and do they kind of wonder what form the Spanish is when they kind of interact, if they ever interact with Ladino today?
Yeah, I don't think there's much interaction with Ladino today in Cuba. There have been concerts of Sephardic music. There have been musicians and singers who have gone and performed in Cuba. So there's definitely an awareness of Ladino because they've gone and sung songs in Ladino. And also, I didn't get to show the clip that of Albertico Behar, where he integrates Sephardic songs into the service that he leads at the Patronato. So it's interesting, he's a Sephardic Jew, but he leads services often at the Patronato, which was built as an Ashkenazi synagogue, but now it's all very mixed. And, and he sings, what's that beautiful song? Abraham Avinu, Padre Querido. He sings these songs, he integrates those into the religious service. And it actually reminds me of Temple Moses in Miami. And whenever I'm in Miami, I don't know if there's anybody from Temple Moses out in the audience today, but I love going to Temple Moses because they integrate Ladino songs into the service, and I love, hearing the Ladino. So definitely within the Jewish community, people are familiar with Ladino, people both of Ashkenazi and Sephardic background. They all know about it. They've heard the music. They've seen concerts. Albertico has introduced it into the services in Havana. And there are, of course, Sephardic Jews, as I said, in the provinces as well. So they're familiar. And I would say people like Julio Eli, who I mentioned, and David Tached, who are kind of now elders in the community. They, of course, remember a lot of words in Ladino. Roberto Behar, who I mentioned with the Dos Ocas, he has a lot of memories of Ladino. But I would say that that non-Jews probably don't know very much about it unless they're interested in music. And like I said, there have been some concerts also beyond the Jewish community. I remember, I forget what concert it was, but there was a concert of Sephardic music that was held in the synagogue. And then those musicians also performed in just a Cuban concert setting. And so I think that there is familiarity with Ladino among people who are interested in, in musical cultures and so on. But I wouldn't say it's familiar to, to the whole Cuban mainstream.
One last question here for this evening. Just out of curiosity, what do you attest to the fact that Castro and the communist leadership were relatively tolerant to a Jewish community existing in Cuba at all?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very interesting question. And that's what has led some people to speculate, well, are the Castros somehow of Sephardic descent themselves? The name Castro, the second last name is Ruz, R-U-Z. And at least according to one of Fidel Castro's children, a daughter who left Cuba and wrote this memoir, she claimed that that one of his grandfathers was a Sephardic Jew from Turkey and was a street peddler. Many of the Sephardic Jewish men were peddlers. My grandfather was a peddler. So that's one speculation, that maybe he was himself of Sephardic ancestry. So there's that that's one speculation. But I personally think it's about the fact that he had a lot of respect for those Jews that stayed in Cuba. As I mentioned, Fabio Grobart, I forgot what his name, his like original Yiddish name was something like Abraham Weinstein or something, but he took on the name of Fabio Grobart. And he was, as I said, one of the founders of the Cuban Communist Party in 1925. And he was the one who would introduce Fidel Castro at the meetings of the Communist Party in Cuba up through the 1990s when he passed away. And so I think there was some possible respect for that, possibly for the fact that Karl Marx was a Jew and they had instilled this Marxist system. I mean, I think there may have been a number of different reasons. I happened to actually hear Fidel Castro give a speech at the Patronato Synagogue in the late 1990s. He had come for the Hanukkah party. I mentioned the Hanukkah parties are very, very big in the community. I was a little scared because I had just gone to the Hanukkah party. I had no idea if Fidel Castro was going to come to the party. And once he arrived, all of his bodyguards were put in place and you couldn't leave the synagogue. So I was kind of forced to stay there and listen to his speech. And he gave a very, very long speech. He had done all this research on the Maccabean revolt and kind of related it to the Cuban Revolution and talked about, you know, the Jews as this like very special people. And so not to exaggerate, but I think he may have had actually respect for the Jews as a community. And unlike the former Soviet Union, where, you know, Jews really had to go into hiding, you know, that didn't happen in Cuba. As I said, the kosher butcher shop was maintained. You know, Jews could be Jews. They had to, of course, attend public school like everybody else, but then on Sundays they could have the Sunday school. You know, so there were these accommodations made, which again suggested some sense of consideration. And Fidel Castro actually gave a speech like in 1961 or 62 when all the Jews were leaving Cuba, where he said something to the effect of, I don't know why all the Jewish people are leaving. We have nothing against Jewish people. So I think that there was this special consideration, this interest and this curiosity in the Jewish community, and they just followed a completely different policy. Though on the other hand, also has to be said that Cuba broke relations with Israel after the Yom Kippur War. So there was also that. And so it may seem that they're not supportive of the Jewish people because of that. But in fact, there has also been a lot of Israeli investment in Cuba in banking. And the Israelis have been very involved in helping with agriculture as well, particularly with the growing of oranges and grapefruits in the Matanzas region. A lot of Israeli engineers have been involved in that. So it's a very complex relationship, but I think Jewish people overall will tell you if you ask them in Cuba today that they have not experienced the kind of anti-Semitism or the kind of anti-Semitic violence that we have seen in places like Argentina, for example. That kind of thing has not happened in Cuba. Adela Dworin often points out that people just come in and out of the synagogues. There, you know, isn't the kind of elaborate security system that unfortunately is necessary in so many synagogues because of potential violence. So I think that's all interesting to keep in mind. It's a different culture from other Jewish Latin American cultures.
Okay, with that, I want to thank you so much, Professor Behar, for taking the time out to speak with us this evening with a wonderful lecture. As you can see, we've had quite a number of people here tonight, including many from De los Muertos communities. You know, we have a few people, even our friend Jake, for example, said that he knew your parents very well from Canarsie. So Canarsie to Temple Moses, Miami, we have all the spread and so many others joining us tonight. But I want to thank you again for being with us this evening. Professor Behar's new book, Letters from Cuba, comes out August 25th this month in 2020. You can find it wherever you can find books as well. And I want to thank everybody again for joining us this evening. If you're interested at all in participating in a class and potentially sponsoring a class in the future, please reach out. We depend on your support. This is all a volunteer nonprofit effort through our new Sephardic Digital Academy. If you have any questions or any thoughts, please email us at info@sephardicbrotherhood.com. And you can also find out more about our ongoing classes at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. Professor Behar, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Buenas noches, noche buena, as we say in Ladino. Thank you all.
Buenas noches.